Have you ever really, really wanted something? Like a trip to Disneyland or a new car? Somebody's giggling. What did you do to get it? Did you wish on a star? Did you pray every night when you went to bed? Did you beg and plead with your parents or your spouse to let you have it? Did you save every penny you made until you could afford to get it for yourself? When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I really, really wanted a guitar for Christmas. And I told everyone in my family, my parents and my grandparents and my cousins and my aunts and uncles, that Santa was bringing me a guitar. I had talked to Santa in the mall, and Santa had promised me a guitar. And my cousin, who is a little older than me, who I really adored, played the guitar, and she even promised me free lessons when I got my guitar. And I arrived in the living room that Christmas morning and discovered that there was no guitar under the Christmas tree. Santa had decided that I wasn't quite old enough for a guitar and that I most likely wouldn't practice and it would gather dust in my closet. I was really disappointed. But guitars and trips to Disneyland and cars aren't the only things that we hope and pray for. We hope and pray that people we love will get well when they're sick. We hope and pray that the money in our bank account will be enough to cover the bills until the next time we get paid. We hope and pray that we will be safe when we find ourselves in a bad neighborhood late at night. We hope and pray for the things that we want and need. Sometimes we get them, and sometimes we don't. And this is where I find myself challenged with our gospel passage today. In this passage we read from the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can tell this mulberry tree to uproot itself and replant itself in the sea, and it will obey you." And every time I read this passage, or one of the similar ones in the other Gospels where we're told we can move mountains, I cringe a little bit. And I found myself doing that as I read this passage this week. I had that icky feeling I get. And I wondered why I dislike this saying of Jesus so much. And as it rolled around in my head and I sat with it this week, I realized that I dislike it because I think we misuse it. And we misuse it in such a way that we end up judging other people and beating up on ourselves because of it. At first glance, this passage makes it look like we're magic. Like we can say something and it will just happen the way we want it to. It's as if suddenly we are Harry Potter or Hermione Granger, and all we have to do is wave our magic wand and we will have what we want or what we need. And this is where we get in trouble with this saying. How many times have you thought to yourself, if only I had prayed harder, if only I had gone to church more, if only I had believed more, that bad thing wouldn't have happened to me? How often have you heard that said about someone else? If only they were more faithful. that bad thing wouldn't have happened to them. I find it hard to believe that Jesus would say something to us simply so that we could fail at it, so that we could feel bad about ourselves, or so that we could point a finger at someone else for what seems like a lack of faith. So does that make this untrue? Is this one of those passages in the Bible that we just decide is too hard to deal with, so we pretend like it doesn't exist? I don't think that's a good idea. 3 of the 4 gospel writers include something like this in their stories. Matthew tells us that with faith the size of a mustard seed, we could move a mountain. Mark tells us that just having faith in God, we can tell a mountain to move into the sea. If 3 of the 4 gospel writers think that this saying of Jesus is important enough to include in the very short stories they wrote about Jesus, it must matter. So the first thing we have to do is look at this text in the context of the larger passage. You'll notice that today I read the gospel from the bulletin and not from the fancy book. I did that because I didn't like the passage that the lectionary people gave us, because they didn't give us the whole story. So I gave y'all the whole story. And I did that because just before Jesus says this, he's talking to the disciples about forgiveness. He tells the disciples that if someone asks for forgiveness, they have to give it to them. Even if they're a repeat offender, even if they repeat the offense 7 times in the same day, if they ask for forgiveness, they have to give it. And the disciples know that this is really hard. And so they say to Jesus, increase our faith. Because they think that having more faith will be the thing that will give them the ability to do what Jesus has asked. But Jesus replies with this saying about faith the size of a mustard seed. Jesus is saying to the disciples that it's not about quantity, it's not about how much faith you have, that it's just about what is sufficient. You only need a little bit of faith. The tasks of discipleship only require a small amount of faith because God will do the rest. A small amount of faith in partnership with God's grace and God's power can transform the world. A couple of years ago, an older woman was in her local bookstore, and she noticed that the young man in line behind her had a large stack of textbooks. When she got to the counter, she insisted that the young man put his things with hers because she was going to pay for his books. He knew how expensive they were, and he protested, but she demanded that he put them on the counter. And she added some chocolate because everybody needs some chocolate. And after paying the $400 bill, the young man, in tears, thanked her profusely and left the store. And the clerk asked her why she had done that. And she said, "It is important to be kind. Every day we accidentally hurt people without even knowing it. And so it is important to be intentionally kind." She went on to explain that her son is a homeless meth addict, and that she saw her son in that young man standing behind her. That she spends every day wondering what she did wrong, and thinking maybe if someone had been kind to him at just the right moment, things might have turned out differently for him. A month ago, in a high school, a predominantly black high school in Tennessee, a new freshman, a scrawny little white kid, was in class, and his classmates were making fun of him because he wears the same clothes to school every day. Not everyone was saying cruel things, but most everyone was laughing, and no one did anything to intervene. Later that evening, one of the boys who had been in that classroom, a relatively popular football player who happens to be African American, reflected upon what happened in that classroom that day and realized that he had done the wrong thing. He had not been making any of the cruel jokes, but he had been laughing along. And so he went to his own closet, where he filled a bag with clothes. And he texted a friend who said, "I have a new pair of sneakers, I can bring them tomorrow." And the next day they pulled that young boy out of class, and they apologized to him, and they gave him clothing. And that young boy later remarked that he had been bullied his whole life, and that was the first time that a peer had ever given him a gift. These are tiny acts of kindness. Tiny acts of kindness born out of faith the size of a mustard seed that result in an abundance of love. That woman in that store had a tiny amount of faith that one act of kindness could change the course of someone's whole life. That young football player had a tiny amount of faith that reconciliation and forgiveness were important. Tiny acts of kindness born out of faith the size of a mustard seed result in abundant love. Love that stretches beyond the giver and the receiver. Love that sets an example for others. Having faith the size of a mustard seed is not about magic. Having faith the size of a mustard seed is about having enough hope that you are compelled to love someone, even if they don't deserve it, even if you don't feel like it, even if they don't look like you, even if they weren't born in the right country, even if you don't know what the outcome will be. Tiny acts of kindness born from faith that is the size of a mustard seed are multiplied by God's grace and God's power and can do more than we can ask or imagine. Amen.